This is a bit of a weird one for me. I think it's one that I had asked a couple people what they saw coming before, because I really had hoped we would never be at this crossroads with Marvel, Sony, and Spider-Man. Spider-Man is out of the MCU. That's what everybody's reporting on, that Spider-Man's gone. That's not entirely true yet. We don't fully know that. But yesterday, an article came out from Deadline. Disney Sony standoff ends Marvel Studios and Kevin Feige's involvement in Spider-Man. I'm not saying that Deadline is wrong. However, there are more layers to this story, and it doesn't fully mean that he's out of the MCU. What is going on right now is there's an inability to make a deal, a follow-up deal between the Marvel Studios executives, which, obviously their parent company is Disney, so Disney kind of pulls the strings on that one, and the Sony executives. Now, a lot of their previous deal is not super well known to the public, or at least it wasn't until recently, because they had struck an interesting deal before, and you're going to hear me clicking around just to make sure I have, all my sources up. I'm not mischaracterizing anything at all. But the current arrangement right now for the Spider-Man films is that Disney holds merchandising rights. Now, you know what merchandising is, obviously. Anything from toys to maybe even board games to official movie merchandise like shirts, any of this stuff, Marvel's getting that money. So Disney's holding that merchandising right, and they get 5% of the first dollar gross. That's how much it makes on its day of release. They're only getting 5% of that. It's not actually that much, believe it or not, no matter how much money these movies are making. Yeah, it's more than you and I will probably make in a year, but it's not much to a company. But Sony holds distribution and screen rights to Spider-Man solo films. Any of these solo films, they hold those rights. And that starts with the Sam Raimi movies back in 2002 with Tobey Maguire and pushes out into current day. It's really an in perpetuity type of thing. Now, Disney was pushing for a 50-50 co-financing agreement. Now, a lot of this is coming from Ars Technica, what I'm reading off of right here. I'm doing my best to put it in my own words too, but if you hear this and you think, wow, I read this somewhere else, everybody's kind of reporting the same almost word-for-word thing here. But the TLDR is that Marvel, Disney, 5% of the first day and marketing, and merchandise, that's what they get. And then Sony gets all of the money from the movies, other than that 5% of the first day. And now Disney wanted to get this 50-50 co-financing. They both pay 50%. If the next Spider-Man movie was going to be $10, they flew Tobey Maguire out. They pulled up the Snapchat filter for 5 minutes and put a bag on his head. Each of the companies would pay $5 a piece. And then they would get most likely a 50-50 payout. That's kind of debatable depending on where you read about this. But 50-50 to pay for it, 50-50 payout most likely. However, what's not being reported on is that Disney, I'm sure, would keep the merchandising. So I want to point out that Sony is not the bad guy here. I'm not saying they're in the right. I'm not saying that they are not somewhat in the wrong. I think both companies are, but I don't think it's as simple as Sony bad, Marvel good. It's almost never that simple in business, and I would say here it's not either. Now, there's been a lot of debate on whether or not this means he's actually out of the MCU. If you've seen Spider-Man Far From Home, little spoiler warning, I'm not going to go into details, but again, he's really being set up as this protege, which you saw in the previous movies to Iron Man, and it would be really weird to just nix him out of the MCU completely. There's a few different possibilities going forward, but first I think it's important to read the actual response from the Sony spokesperson that actually commented, because a lot of people are not actually reporting on this part of the story, or if they are, they're updating their original article that already got all the hits. That's gotten 50,000 people have read that, and then maybe 2,000 see the update. So I want to cover that all in just one big blast here. The Sony executive, well, it's not a Sony executive, the Sony spokesperson who actually commented on this development came back and spun it a different way. This spokesperson said that Much of today's news, and obviously yesterday, about Spider-Man has mischaracterized recent discussions about Kevin Feige's involvement in the franchise. We are disappointed but respect Disney's decision not to have him continue as a lead producer of our next live-action Spider-Man film. We hope this might change in the future, but understand that the many new responsibilities that Disney has given him, including all their newly added Marvel properties, do not allow time for him to work on an IP they do not own. Kevin is terrific, and we are grateful for his help and guidance and appreciate the path he has helped us on, which will continue. Now, this is the statement I wanted to talk about for a couple minutes here as well, and just elaborate a couple things. First off, it's business talk. I understand that there's layers and layers and layers to business talk. A lot of it's spun positively. You know, you don't want to take a crap in a bed that you might be asked to sleep in later. They're not going to, you know, shoot Kevin Feige, shoot his public persona in the head over this one, over at Sony, because they don't want to slam that door shut. I think Sony knows that the Marvel deal is good for them. And I think that Marvel knows and Disney knows that the deal is good for them. I just think that there's corporate greed, as always, going on behind the scenes with any of these things. And I don't think that makes you a hater or a negative Nancy to notice that, because obviously both companies were printing money off of this. And yes, Marvel before was not making money really from those solo Spider-Man movies, but come on. You're throwing him in Infinity War and Endgame, Civil War. You know how many people showed up to Civil War just because Spider-Man was revealed in the trailer? I'm not saying people wouldn't have seen it otherwise, that's ridiculous. But he is a box office draw even to your non-solo movies. It's obvious that he's printing money for Marvel and Disney, even if they just gave up everything on it and just paid for the movies. It would pretty much be worth keeping that character in their team-ups and just guaranteeing he's in the MCU. But at the same time, there's layers to this, because Sony is also spinning this as it being Marvel and Disney's fault. And in some ways, sure, you can say it is by trying to renegotiate that deal. In other ways, you could say it's Sony's for not budging. I don't think it's black and white. But they have left the door open to Spider-Man coming back. I think that's important to point out. They say that they respect Disney's decision, so they're putting the blame on Disney here, to have Kevin Feige continue as a lead producer, or to not have him continue as a lead producer of the next live-action Spider-Man film. But they say that they hope this might change in the future. Now, if you understand business, obviously you know, one, they're leaving the door open. Two, this is an obvious marketing tactic. They are trying a marketing negotiating tactic. They are trying to kind of put this ball back in Marvel and Disney's court and say, hey, look, we want you. We want you on our team. Don't you want to work with us? Don't you want to play ball, be on our team? And they're giving that decision to Disney. However, Sony is just as stubborn here and not willing to budge. And I get why they're not. They're making a lot of money off the Spider-Man IP. Totally get that. There's also a little what I interpret as a not passive-aggressive but subtle dig at Marvel to directly reference Kevin Feige not having time to work on IP they, Marvel, do not own. Which, again, if you know anything about the comics industry, that's a bit of a dig, because Marvel was forced to sell off a lot of their high-profile solo film rights, including Spider-Man, The Incredible Hulk, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, way back because they were losing money bad. They were bankrupt, pretty much. The company was failing. And so they kind of took desperate measures to really help their actual company survive. Now, there's been a lot of different people chiming in. Even Jeremy Renner on Instagram he added Sony pictures and said, we want Spider-Man back, to at the real Stan Lee and at Marvel, please, thank you. And he said, congrats, Spider-Man rocks, please. And I'm sure he was, having some fun with it. Great actor, seems like a great sport. But there is a bit of a problem here. Now, either Sony needs to back off and just take 50% less from these movies, which, I'm sorry, if you're a company, that's a sucky deal Doesn't matter who you are, that is a sucky deal. Especially after how much money Far From Home made. They either need to back off and do that and just cut their profits in half, or Marvel and Disney need to back off and for the first time in probably the last decade look pretty weak. Disney's acquired so much. And Disney's kind of at the point where it's surprising that antitrust laws allow them to be that big and operate in America, at least to me, considering that they own some of the biggest fictional properties ever. And they control, I was looking at numbers before, I believe it's close to 40% of the box office, the global box office is controlled by Disney as far as like just profits made from films. You have to think, they own all of the Pixar stuff, they own all the Marvel stuff, now they're owning all the Fox stuff, and then on top of that, you have the little tiny slice of the pie they got from that 5% of the first day of Spider-Man. Doesn't really matter, but again, they have their hands in everything, especially Star Wars. That is a huge moneymaker for them. So I want to point out that Disney could stand to back down here and just bite the bullet on that one. I mean, they are printing money. They don't need the profits from this film. They don't need it at all. And that's really what the heart of this issue is nobody needs this renegotiation. Their terms were fine. They worked fine for both parties. But this is how corporate America works, and corporations in general. It's not just here. If I have a business and I'm making $20 and you come to me and you're like, but you can make 10, why would I say yes to you? Why would I ever say, yeah, sure, I'll make 10 instead of 20? Or, on the other hand, if I'm working with you and you feel like you're doing all the work and I'm screwing you over, why wouldn't you go and work with someone else? Marvel's in a position where, even though they've awkwardly set Spider-Man up as a future key figure in the MCU, they could just as easily about face and move on from him. They have pretty much everybody back except for him. And the Hulk, they're in a position where they don't need Hulk solo movies at all. In fact, nobody wants them. Nobody wants a Hulk solo movie at all. There's a few outliers there, but we're good without him. So this is kind of the thing, is like, Marvel's okay without Spider-Man. It doesn't mean we, the fans of the MCU, are okay without Spider-Man in it. That sucks. But Marvel knows that they could get away without him. Meanwhile, Sony is kind of at this point where they're realizing maybe they don't need Marvel. The last two Spider-Man movies have been immensely popular. The general population that goes to movies, I'm not saying is stupid, but they're not informed. They're not doing research on the films they're seeing. So they'll see Spider-Man in the title and be like, well, Spider-Man, I'll go see. And that'll be it to them. So Sony realizes that. On top of that, they actually made so much money, off of actually the Spider-Verse, not only just Into the Spider-Verse being in theaters, but also its DVD, Blu-ray, 4K release along with streaming. So they made a lot there, and Venom was immensely profitable for them, and Marvel had very little to do with Venom. It's not even in the MCU as far as we know. It's never been actually confirmed to be. So we're at a point where both of these companies are kind of feeling like they don't need each other. But on the outside, the consumer kind of sees how they're giving each other the best of both worlds. Sony can give Marvel specific styles of movie making that maybe Marvel doesn't always do on their own, with like the visuals from Spider-Man and some of the cinematography and stuff that they don't do, along with technology and marketing that maybe Marvel and Disney don't always do on their own, while Marvel can give Sony direction that they've clearly needed since Raimi left the franchise, the Spider-Man as a whole franchise way back, and really help them spin it into a cohesive narrative that spans not only a Spider-Man trilogy plus, but also into the MCU as a whole. Now, moving past all this, because that's really where we're at, an impasse. We don't know what's going to happen. I just want to say that we don't for sure know that Spider-Man is out of the MCU. There is still a possibility that some kind of deal could be worked out. We know that Sony has left that door open. We know the ball is in Marvel's court. But even if a deal wasn't worked out, or maybe a simpler deal was worked out, Spider-Man's own solo movies could still technically be in the MCU. They're not likely going to just kill Spider-Man after the Far From Home, like in between movies. It makes sense that if it's the same actor, the same cast, and even if Zendaya is still in the movies, that it's still in the MCU. I'm just not entirely sure how they're going to spin that, because they wouldn't be able to show characters from the MCU anymore that are crossover without Marvel. There's also the possibility that this is, as some outlets have said, more overproducing credit. So there could still be a not renegotiation, and that Marvel doesn't actually have a hand in these movies anymore, but that they sort of allow them to exist in the MCU. I'm just not sure how this is going to happen going forward. Would there be a universe split in which Tom Holland's Spider-Man is pulled out of the MCU? How would that happen? How would the MCU operate without their new Iron Man, in a way? I mean, he's not Iron Man, but he kind of is. Just how do all these companies operate independently going forward? And because of all these different things, I think that we need to look at this and take it all with a grain of salt and not get super, super mad about it, because it's very easy to. It's very easy to look at this and say Sony's being really obstinate and they don't want to actually make good movies because their Spider-Man movies on their own suck and they should just sell them back to Marvel. That's very easy to do. It's also very easy to look at it from the Sony perspective and say, well, Marvel and Disney are being ridiculous. We give them so much by having worked this deal out with them. They are able to use this character in all these team-up movies, and it brings them brand recognition, and people, it gets butts in the seats. Why are they trying to renegotiate this and screw us? Both of these companies feel, I'm sure, like they're the one in the right. So it kind of comes down to a weird point for us, the consumer. What do we think about it? Now, I personally would be really disappointed if Spider-Man was taken out of the MCU. At the same time, he's gotten 2 amazing movies and multiple team-up movies. It's not like we haven't gotten a good dose of him. It's just a disappointment. I think what would really suck is if they somehow kept writing this same character, but just pretended that the MCU years never happened. I just don't know how they'd go about that. But even if it operated within the MCU and a deal wasn't renegotiated, I'd be okay with Spider-Man going back to his solo movies if they were good. It's just hard for me as a consumer to see them being good after things like The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. And I think it's a real shame that this is coming in the way of what the consumer wants. But again, I guess welcome to business. The consumer doesn't matter until he hurts your wallet. So what I would say is, if there's never more news to this as far as they don't renegotiate a deal, and you're against Sony just keeping Spider-Man in their own universe, don't go see the Spider-Man Far From Home sequel. Seriously, don't go see it. That doesn't mean you can't see it, and that doesn't mean that you have to pirate it to see it. You know, there's this thing called half-price books, a pawn shop, a lot of places you can buy a movie used where these people don't get a dime of your money. At all. Ever. If I go into a pawn shop and I buy a copy of the Far From Home sequel, Sony's never seen a dime of that, and neither is Marvel. They saw the initial sale and nothing else. So I would say put your money where your mouth is. And there are a lot of petitions floating around. I don't think these petitions do anything. I retweeted one of them over on my Twitter about Sony reselling to Marvel. That's not going to happen. These petitions are, in a lot of ways, meaningless. But I think that it's still worth making your voice heard, speaking out on social media, maybe even signing a petition and saying, at the very least, you're saying that, hey, we want Spider-Man to stay where he is. You're not saying either company's in the right or wrong. Really, it's not that simple. But, I don't know. Anyway, guys, I'm interested to see what you think down below. Hopefully I shined a little more light on some parts of the story that you didn't know. If I didn't, I'm sorry. There's a lot of conflicting information out there, and maybe we'll actually hear more in the next couple days. I'm really hoping so. Fingers crossed. I love the MCU. I love Spider-Man. And you know what? I think Marvel, Disney, and Sony all make great stuff, but I'm really sick of rich jerk-offs in business suits ruining fun for the rest of us because they want $1.1 billion and not $1 billion. But I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.